Cats isn't scary because he's a cat. He's scary because he's your neighbor. He's the person who runs the motel at the end of the road, who smiles and speaks softly and seems perfectly normal until you notice that something about him is slightly, irreversibly wrong. That's not just a scary cartoon villain. That's a documented phobia. And once you see it in cats, you start seeing it everywhere in Courage the Cowardly Dog. Fred, the Quilt Club, the Mattress Demon, the Great Fusilli, each one maps onto a real, clinically studied fear with a precision that feels too consistent to be accidental. But it was accidental. And understanding why it happened tells you something real about how children's television works, what broadcast regulations actually do, and why the scariest cartoon of the 1990s hit so much harder than it had any right to. Courage the Cowardly Dog premiered on Cartoon Network in November 1999, created by John R. Dilworth through his production company Stretch Films. It ran for 4 seasons until 2002, airing in a programming block aimed at children ages 6 to 11, though it quickly attracted an older audience who recognized that Dilworth was doing something unusual with children's horror. The show originated from Dilworth's 1995 animated short The Chicken from Outer Space, which was nominated for an Academy Award and caught Cartoon Network's attention during their push for original programming. The production operated under standard broadcast constraints for children's television, a TVY7 rating, no realistic violence, no graphic content. Within those limits, Dilworth and a rotating team of writers built something that functioned less like a cartoon and more like a sustained exercise in psychological dread. Here's the argument. The villains encourage the Cowardly Dog map onto documented clinical phobias with a precision that goes beyond coincidence or common horror tropes. But this wasn't Dilworth's secret master plan, and no one in the writer's room was consulting the DSM. What happened is that the production constraints of late 1990s children's television broadcast standards that prohibited realistic violence, the mandate to generate genuine fear within a Y7 rating, and the structural framework of the show itself systematically channeled every writer who worked on this show toward the same class of stimuli, primal, pre-rational fear triggers that clinical psychology has already catalogued. The show accidentally built a taxonomy of childhood terror, and the reason it works so well is that it hits the fears children actually have, not the fears adults think children should have. Let me walk through the evidence in 3 parts. First, the phobia mapping itself. Cats appears across multiple episodes and is always introduced the same way, civilized, polite, soft-spoken, running some respectable establishment. A motel. A submarine. A candy shop. And he's always slightly wrong. His voice is too smooth. His movements are too controlled. He inhabits what the roboticist Masahiro Mori termed the uncanny valley, the space where something looks almost normal but not quite, triggering a deep visceral rejection. Clinical psychology documents this as automatonophobia, the fear of things that appear human or alive but aren't. Cats isn't a monster who jumps out at you. He's a monster who invites you in and makes you uncomfortable before you can articulate why. Then there's Fred. The episode Freaky Fred presents a barber who is polite, charming, and deeply fixated on cutting hair, specifically, cutting it against the subject's will. Fred's sing-song monologue about being naughty isn't random creepiness. It's a specific fear structure, the violation of bodily autonomy by someone who appears socially acceptable. The episode depicts a figure who enters your personal space, restrains you socially if not physically, and alters your body without your consent. This maps onto documented specific phobias related to restraint and bodily violation. The Quilt Club, the Mattress Demon, the Great Fusilli who turns people into puppets, these share a common structure. They're all about absorption. Being consumed into something larger. Losing your individual self and becoming part of something else. The pattern suggests what psychology describes as boundary dissolution anxiety, the fear of losing the distinction between self and world, between your body and whatever is outside it. So we have at least 3 distinct phobia categories emerging: the uncanny, bodily violation, and absorption. And this isn't exhaustive. King Ramses brings the fear of inescapable consequence, something you did wrong that will follow you without relief. Various episodes play with claustrophobic entrapment, the fear of being closed in with no exit. What matters is that these aren't random scary designs. They cluster around specific, documented fear structures. Second, the production constraints. Dilworth ran the show through stretch films and maintained creative oversight across all 4 seasons. The show employed multiple writers across its run. You can verify this from the episode credits, and yet the phobic patterns hold throughout. If the mapping were the product of a single writer's vision, you'd expect it concentrated in their episodes and absent elsewhere. Instead, it's distributed. The cause isn't a person. It's a structure. And that structure has a name: broadcast standards for children's television in the late 1990s. Cartoon Network's programming was governed by standards that prohibited realistic violence, graphic content, and explicit physical threat. You could not show someone being genuinely hurt in a way that looked real. But, and this is crucial, there was no regulation against psychological dread. The broadcast standards were designed to prevent physical harm from being depicted. They were not designed to address, and probably could not have anticipated, the kind of pre-rational, phobic fear that doesn't require violence at all. Now, I want to be direct with you about what the evidence can and cannot show. No production record documents Dilworth or any writer sitting down and saying, "Let's map this episode onto automatonophobia." The epistemic ceiling here is interpretive. The pattern is visible in the text, the production context explains why it would emerge, but we cannot confirm conscious intent. What the evidence shows is structural tendency, not deliberate design. This reading argues from convergence. The text, the production structure, and the industrial constraints all point the same direction. So if you're a writer tasked with creating a scary villain for a children's cartoon, and you can't use realistic violence, and you can't show genuine physical harm, what's left? You're left with exactly the class of stimuli that clinical phobias target: the uncanny, bodily violation without visible injury, entrapment, the dissolution of the self. These fears don't require violence or blood. They require the suggestion that something is wrong. The wrongness Katz embodies, the violation Fred enacts, the absorption that Quilt Club represents. The broadcast standards didn't just allow these fears. They actively channeled writers toward them by cutting off every other avenue for generating dread. Third, the show's framework itself. The phobia mapping doesn't just exist in the villains. It exists in the structure. Courage takes place in nowhere, Kansas, the middle of isolation. The nearest help is beyond reach. This is autophobia made physical, the fear of being alone, of having no one to come when you call. And then there are Courage's guardians. Eustace Bagg is hostile, dismissive, and actively threatening. He repeatedly tells Courage he's unwanted, he's stupid, he's not part of the family. The episode depicts abandonment anxiety as a structural feature of daily life, the fear that the adults who should protect you will reject you instead. Muriel is loving but helpless. She can't protect Courage. She can't protect herself. The show gives its protagonist 2 guardians, one who threatens to leave you and one who can't save you. That's the architecture of childhood fear. Courage himself is small, isolated, and responsible for threats beyond his capacity. He has to face monsters that adults ignore or can't handle. He has to solve problems he's not equipped for alone. This is the experience of childhood rendered as horror. You're too small, the adults are useless or hostile, and the thing in the dark is coming whether you're ready or not. So, the villains map onto phobias. The production constraints explain why. The show's framework ensures those phobias land with maximum force on their actual target audience, children who recognize, even if they can't articulate it, that this is what their world feels like sometimes. Now the strongest counterargument. You're reading intentional psychological depth into what's just a horror cartoon using common genre tropes. Katz isn't automatonophobia, he's just a creepy villain. Fred isn't a specific phobia, he's just disturbing humor. The isolated setting isn't autophobia, it's just a convenient way to keep the story contained. And there's real merit to this. Many of these patterns appear in other horror media. The uncanny villain predates Maury's concept by centuries. Isolation as a horror setting is older than the Gothic novel. These are common tropes because they're common fears. The question isn't whether Courage invented them. It's whether Courage's specific production conditions explain why they appear with this density and this precision in this particular show. If these were just common tropes, you'd expect them distributed roughly equally across children's horror programming of the same era. But Courage's contemporaries on Cartoon Network didn't produce the same effect. Shows like Johnny Bravo, Dexter's Laboratory, and Ed, Edd n Eddy used different genre conventions and generated different emotional responses. Courage was unusual in its era for how consistently it targeted dread rather than surprise, phobic discomfort rather than startle. The counter-argument accounts for the presence of these fears. It doesn't account for their concentration. If this thesis holds, it tells us something specific about what was possible in children's television at the turn of the millennium. The broadcast standards that governed Courage were designed to protect children from physical harm depicted on screen. What they inadvertently created was a show that targeted the fears those standards couldn't reach, the fears that don't require violence, that don't require blood, that operate through suggestion and wrongness and the uncanny. The regulations cut off the fears children can rationalize away, that's not real, that's just pretend violence, and left open the fears children can't, that feeling is real, that wrongness is something I felt. It also tells us something about the relationship between creative constraints and artistic outcomes. Dilworth and his team weren't trying to build a phobia catalog. They were trying to make a scary show within limits that excluded the most obvious tools of horror. Those limits pushed them towards something more psychologically precise than they might have achieved with full freedom. The show's power doesn't come despite the constraints. It comes because of them. And it reveals something about who children's horror is really for. The phobias Courage targets, abandonment, the uncanny, loss of self, entrapment, aren't adult anxieties dressed up for kids. They're the specific fears developmental psychology identifies as primary in childhood, the fears that precede rational thought and persist long after we've learned to dismiss them. Courage works because it treats childhood fear as real fear. The framework this suggests is simple. Every creative decision happens within constraints, and those constraints shape the work in ways no single creator fully controls. When you watch Courage the Cowardly Dog, you're not seeing one person's vision of fear. You're seeing what happens when a team of writers, working within broadcast standards that prohibited realistic violence, in a structure that isolated their protagonist, on a show that demanded dread, kept arriving at the same destination, the specific, documented fears that children carry and adults forget. The question this opens isn't whether Courage was secretly about phobias. It's what other patterns are hiding in children's media, not because someone put them there, but because the conditions of production made them inevitable.